Have you ever wondered how just a few words whispered to yourself can dramatically alter the course of your day or even your life? Imagine the power that lies within a single thought. This isn't just poetic musings, it's rooted in the teachings of Stoicism, where the sage harnesses the power of the mind to transform external challenges into wisdom and strength. Today, we're diving deep into how the Stoic practice of mindful self-talk can not only guide you through life's tumultuous seas, but also shape the very reality you experience. Now, if you're someone who's skeptical about the influence of mere thoughts on reality, this video might challenge some of your core beliefs, but I urge you to stay with us until the end. Today's journey through the Stoic art of mental discipline promises not just intriguing ideas, but practical wisdom that you can start applying right now to see real changes. So, if you're ready to explore how ancient philosophy meets modern psychological science to unlock a life of greater fulfillment and control, make sure to subscribe, like, and share this video. Spread the wisdom with others who are on their own paths to personal growth and philosophical understanding. Let's dive into how you can harness the power of your thoughts to not just react to life, but actively create it. Stay tuned and let's unlock the secrets together. The science behind thoughts. It might sound a bit like magic, but it's actually grounded in solid neuroscience and psychology. Every time you have a thought, whether it's a simple idea about what to eat for breakfast or a complex belief about your own abilities, your brain is working hard. It fires neurons that communicate through synapses, creating neural pathways. These pathways are like the roads of your brain, guiding how you think and respond to the world around you. Now consider for a moment how this process is influenced by Stoic philosophy, which teaches us that it's not the external events themselves that affect us, but rather our opinions about them. This aligns perfectly with what we know in neuroscience. When you consistently think in a certain way, let's say you often think you're not good enough, your brain starts to solidify this thought into a fixed route, a well-paved road, making it the default reaction to relevant situations. But here's where it gets really interesting and empowering. Just as you can build a pathway of doubt, you can also construct highways of confidence. Each time you challenge a negative thought and replace it with a positive affirmation, you're not just being optimistic, you're physically changing the landscape of your brain. This concept, known in psychology as neuroplasticity, shows that our brains are not static, but are continually reshaped by our experiences and thoughts. Now, Stoicism doesn't just stop at monitoring thoughts. It pushes us to actively replace harmful thoughts with beneficial ones. Imagine you're facing a tough situation at work. Instead of allowing a spiral of stress and negativity, you can adopt a Stoic view, seeing this as an opportunity to test your resilience and adaptability. This isn't just a mental trick. By doing this, you're steering your brain's chemistry. Positive, empowering thoughts help release neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin, which make you feel better and more capable of handling challenges. So when we talk about the science of thoughts in the realm of Stoicism, we're not just discussing abstract philosophy. We're talking about practical biological changes that you can initiate right now. Each positive thought you choose is a step on the path to not only a more joyful and fulfilling life, but a profoundly healthier brain. By embracing Stoic practices and understanding the science behind it, you can begin to see that you're not at the mercy of external events, but actually in command of your reactions and, ultimately, your personal happiness. This powerful realization opens up a path not just to momentary relief, but to lasting transformation. The practice of positive self-talk. This is about the dialogue you have with yourself daily, which can lift you up or pull you down. Stoicism teaches us that the words we tell ourselves can significantly impact our emotions and decisions. This philosophy doesn't just encourage positive thinking, but advocates for a realistic and empowered way to engage with our own minds. So, what does positive self-talk look like in practice? It starts with awareness, being mindful of the conversations you're having with yourself. Are you being a harsh critic? If so, it's time to shift that narrative. For instance, instead of saying, "I always mess things up," A Stoic-inspired approach would be to tell yourself, I made a mistake, but I can learn from this. This isn't about sugarcoating the truth, but about viewing your actions and their consequences through a lens of growth and opportunity. But why does this matter? Each word you speak to yourself reinforces a belief about your identity and capabilities. When you change the script from critical to supportive, you're not just boosting your mood, you're building self-efficacy. This is the belief in your ability to handle and influence life's events, a crucial element for achieving goals and overcoming adversity. Now, implementing positive self-talk is a skill much like any other that requires practice and consistency. Begin by catching yourself in the act of negativity, then pause and reframe your thoughts. This might feel forced at first, but just as the Stoics practiced journaling and reflection to cultivate their virtues, you too will find that regular practice makes this a natural part of your thinking pattern. Moreover, Stoicism doesn't merely stop at adjusting thoughts for comfort. It pushes us to prepare for life's inevitable challenges. When you use positive self-talk, you're essentially training your mind to handle stress and setbacks more effectively. By affirming your ability to navigate difficulties, you set the stage not only for resilience, but for thriving in tough situations. It's also important to remember that positive self-talk is not a denial of reality. Stoicism teaches the acceptance of what we cannot change, while encouraging us to change what we can. By speaking kindly and encouragingly to yourself, you focus on what you can control, your responses and your mindset. This alignment with Stoic principles helps cultivate a life not swayed by external circumstances, but anchored in a robust internal foundation. Emotional alignment and visualization. The Stoics were advocates of harmonizing one's emotions with reason, teaching that true contentment comes from within, not from external circumstances. This aligns beautifully with the concept of emotional alignment, where we aim to ensure our emotions support our life goals and values rather than disrupt them. Visualization, a powerful tool in this process, involves vividly picturing in your mind a desired outcome or state of being. It's not about wishful thinking, it's about mentally rehearsing the steps and emotional states you aspire to achieve. For the Stoics, this might have been visualizing themselves handling a difficult situation with calm and composure, thereby preparing their minds to act according to their values when the actual moment arrived. Why does this matter? When you visualize, you're doing more than just daydreaming. You're engaging the brain in a way that it often doesn't distinguish between real and vividly imagined experiences. Neurologically, the act of visualization activates many of the same neural networks that actual task performance does. This means that by regularly visualizing yourself succeeding or being in a state of peace, you're conditioning your brain to follow these patterns in real-life situations. Emotional alignment comes into play when we align these visualizations with our current emotional state. By bringing our emotions into a state that matches our visualizations, we enhance our ability to manifest these visions into reality. For example, if you visualize yourself giving a successful presentation, try to also feel the confidence and excitement now, as you would in that successful moment. This alignment is powerful. The emotions you foster become the fuel that drives the visualization into a tangible outcome. But how can we practically apply these concepts in a Stoic way? Stoicism teaches us to use reason to manage our emotions. In practice, this means using visualization not just to see the outcome, but also to rehearse emotionally intelligent responses to various scenarios. For instance, you might visualize yourself receiving tough feedback and imagine yourself handling it with grace and openness rather than defensiveness or anger. This practice prepares you to stay aligned with your Stoic values of wisdom and temperance, no matter what external circumstances you face. Regular practice of emotional alignment and visualization can transform these exercises from simple techniques to integral parts of your daily routine. Much like the Stoic practice of morning and evening reflections, these reflections help ground you in your philosophical principles and prepare you for both the day ahead and for restful closure. Acknowledging reality stoicism in particular teaches us the importance of seeing the world as it truly is, not just as we wish it to be. This doesn't mean focusing on the negative. Rather, it's about embracing a clear-eyed view of our circumstances, which then informs how we can respond most effectively. When we talk about acknowledging reality in the context of self-improvement, we're often combating our own biases and preconceived notions. It's easy to fall into the trap of either overly pessimistic thinking or overly optimistic daydreaming. A Stoic strives to find the rational middle ground, recognizing the true nature of each situation. This involves seeing the challenges and obstacles clearly, but also recognizing the opportunities and potential for growth. For example, if you're facing a difficult period in your work or personal life, acknowledging reality means admitting these challenges without sugarcoating them. However, unlike a purely negative outlook, this acknowledgement is coupled with the Stoic concept of the obstacle is the way. This idea, popularized by Marcus Aurelius, suggests that every obstacle presents an opportunity to practice virtues like patience, resilience, and creativity. Therefore, when you acknowledge the reality of your situation, you also ask yourself, what can this teach me? How can this strengthen me? This process is deeply empowering. It shifts your perspective from one of passivity, where things happen to you, to one of agency, where you use your circumstances as tools for your own growth. It's about not just facing reality, but actively engaging with it. This engagement involves a dialogue between what is happening around you and your internal response. It's not just about enduring life's storms, but learning how to sail skillfully in response to them. Moreover, acknowledging reality in a Stoic sense also involves preparing for future realities. This is where the practice of premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils, comes into play. Stoics often visualize potential difficulties and setbacks to prepare themselves emotionally and practically. This isn't about pessimism, but about reducing future shocks and ensuring that your responses are as thoughtful and measured as possible. In practice, this means not shying away from the potential downturns or challenges ahead, but instead facing them head-on with a plan and the confidence that you can handle them. This approach fosters profound resilience, as you're no longer as easily rattled by unforeseen issues. You've already considered and prepared for them mentally and emotionally. Consistency and habit formation. The Stoics understood that virtue isn't just a theoretical concept, but something that must be practiced consistently to be meaningful. Similarly, when we talk about building new habits or changing our mindset, consistency is the key that unlocks real transformation. It's about doing the small things day after day until they become a part of who we are. Let's break down why consistency is so crucial. Imagine you're trying to improve your physical health. If you go to the gym only once a month, you're unlikely to see any real progress. The same principle applies to mental and emotional habits. Whether it's practicing gratitude, positive self-talk, or any other psychological skill, regular practice is essential. Each action you take reinforces the neural pathways associated with that behavior, making it easier to repeat. Just as a river gradually carves a path through rock, consistent thought and behavior patterns carve neural pathways in your brain. For Stoics, the daily practice of virtues like discipline, courage, and wisdom was akin to a spiritual exercise or training. They often use the analogy of an athlete in training to describe their philosophical practices. Just as an athlete must train regularly to maintain peak condition, a Stoic must practice their philosophical disciplines daily to maintain their moral and mental fitness. This is where the concept of ascesis, or discipline practice, comes in. It's not about harsh self-denial, but about creating routines that align with our values and strengthen our character. In modern terms, forming a new habit requires consistency because of the compound effect. Small choices and actions, when made consistently over time, result in significant outcomes. If you want to cultivate a more positive outlook, for instance, you need to integrate practices that foster positivity into your daily routine. It could be as simple as starting each day by listing 3 things you're grateful for, or replacing a habitual negative thought with a positive one every time it arises. Moreover, habit formation is not just about what you do, but also about the environment you create to support those habits. The Stoics were big on creating environments that reduce temptations and distractions. This is akin to removing junk food from your home if you're trying to eat healthier. If you want to cultivate better mental habits, you might limit exposure to negative influences, whether there are certain forms of media or even certain relationships that don't support your growth. The challenge, of course, is maintaining these practices even when the initial enthusiasm wanes or when life gets in the way. This is where Stoic endurance or patience comes into play. Stoicism teaches that we should expect and accept obstacles in any worthwhile endeavor. Consistency, then, is not just about sticking to your practices when it's easy, but about having the resilience to continue them even when it's hard. Remember, the goal of habit formation in the Stoic sense isn't just to achieve external success, but to become a better, more fulfilled person. It's about aligning your daily actions with your deepest values and, in doing so, transforming not just your behaviors, but your very character. Resilience through positive speech. This concept is deeply rooted in Stoic philosophy, which teaches us that our words and thoughts have the power to shape our experiences and our reactions to those experiences. Stoicism doesn't merely advocate for endurance of hardship, but for a transformation of hardship into an opportunity for personal growth and fortitude. Let's talk about how positive speech builds resilience. In the Stoic view, words are not simply sounds or written symbols. They are the expressions of our judgments and the forerunners of our actions. When we speak positively, especially about ourselves and our ability to handle life's challenges, we are not just boosting our mood in the moment. We are training ourselves to see adversity as manageable and temporary. This kind of speech reinforces the idea that we have the power and the skills necessary to overcome obstacles, which is key to developing long-term resilience. For example, consider a situation where you face a significant setback. If your immediate reaction is to say, "I can't handle this," you frame the situation as beyond your control. However, by adjusting your language to reflect Stoic principles, saying something like, "This is a challenge, but I have overcome challenges before," you reshape your perception of the situation. This doesn't just help you feel better, it actively engages the problem-solving part of your brain, encouraging a constructive response rather than a defeatist one. Moreover, resilience through positive speech is also about consistency. Repeatedly affirming your capabilities and focusing on solutions rather than problems, this consistent practice embeds these positive affirmations into your subconscious, making them a default setting in tough times. It's like building a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it becomes. In Stoic practice, this might involve daily reflections or meditations where you remind yourself of your strengths and your ability to cope with past difficulties, thereby preparing yourself to face future challenges with confidence. Another aspect of resilience that positive speech supports is emotional regulation. By choosing our words carefully, we can keep our emotions from overwhelming us. Stoics promote an even-tempered approach to life, one where we maintain our composure and think clearly under pressure. Positive speech helps maintain this balance. It acts as a buffer against the kind of negative emotional spirals that can lead to despair or anxiety. Importantly, building resilience through positive speech also involves the community around us. When we speak positively, not only about ourselves but also about others, we foster a supportive environment that enhances collective resilience. This communal aspect was important in Stoic communities, where individuals were seen not only as self-sufficient sages, but also as members of a broader society who could uplift each other. In practice, every time you face a difficulty, take a moment to consciously choose your words. Speak about the situation with hope and agency. Reflect on your past successes and remind yourself that you are capable of navigating challenges. Encourage others with your words and let their encouragement bolster you in return. Over time, this practice of resilience through positive speech will not just help you handle individual challenges. It will transform the way you live your life, turning what was once overwhelming into something within your power to manage. Gratitude and acceptance. The practice of gratitude in particular shifts our focus from what's missing in our lives to the abundance that's already present, fostering a sense of contentment that is remarkably resilient to life's inevitable fluctuations. Stoicism doesn't merely suggest being thankful for the good times. It encourages us to find value even in the challenges. This might seem counterintuitive, but consider this. Every challenge carries with it the seed of an equal or greater benefit. When we practice gratitude, we're not just being thankful for obvious blessings. We're also learning to see the hidden opportunities for growth and learning that come disguised as obstacles. This perspective is vital because it changes how we interact with our environment. It's no longer about enduring life, but about engaging with it actively and positively. Expanding on this, gratitude in the Stoic sense is about appreciating the here and now without incessant longing for more or regret for what's past. It's about recognizing the value of the present moment and the resources we currently have. For instance, rather than bemoaning a lack of resources, a Stoic finds ways to make the most of what is available. This could be as simple as being thankful for the opportunity to develop resourcefulness or resilience traits that will serve you well, regardless of external circumstances. Now, acceptance plays a crucial role alongside gratitude. Acceptance in Stoicism is not about passive resignation, but about recognizing the limits of our control. Stoics distinguish between what we can control, our own thoughts, behaviors, and reactions, and what we can't, which is nearly everything else. By practicing acceptance, we focus our energy and efforts only on those things within our sphere of influence, which is liberating and dramatically reduces unnecessary stress. Together, gratitude and acceptance foster a profound peace of mind. They teach us to be satisfied with what we have and patient with the process of life. This doesn't mean we give up on goals or stop striving for better. Rather, it means we pursue our ambitions with calmness and a positive outlook, secure in the knowledge that we can handle the ups and downs along the way. Incorporating these practices into daily life could involve starting each day by listing things you're grateful for, including the challenges that are part of the day. Whenever you find yourself feeling frustrated or discontented, pause and reflect on this Stoic question. Is this within my control? If not, practice accepting it and redirect your focus towards something you can influence. Over time, these practices cultivate a mental landscape where gratitude and acceptance are the norm rather than the exception. To bring this into a practical context, consider the Stoic exercise of negative visualization. Occasionally contemplate the loss of things you value to increase appreciation for them. This might sound bleak, but it's a powerful way to cultivate a deeper appreciation for your life as it is, reinforcing the habit of gratitude. Empowering questions and future self-talk. These are incredibly powerful tools that align well with Stoic practices. These methods help us focus on what we can control and envision the kind of person we want to become, guiding our actions and thoughts in a more deliberate, virtuous direction. Let's start with empowering questions. These are thoughtfully crafted inquiries that challenge us to think differently and act purposefully. Unlike passive questions that might evoke feelings of helplessness or resignation, empowering questions encourage us to take ownership of our circumstances and envision possible solutions. For example, instead of asking, "Why does this always happen to me?" which positions you as a victim of circumstance, an empowering question would be, "What can I learn from this situation?" Or "How can I use this experience to grow?" This shift in questioning doesn't just alter our immediate response. It changes the trajectory of our thoughts, leading to more constructive and proactive behavior. Stoicism teaches us to use questioning as a tool to examine our lives and our actions critically and compassionately. By regularly asking ourselves questions like, is this within my control, or what virtues can I practice in this moment, we align our behavior with Stoic principles of focusing on our sphere of influence and cultivating virtues. This practice helps us build resilience, develop moral character, and maintain tranquility. Now, let's discuss future self-talk. This is a technique where you speak to yourself as if you've already become the person you strive to be. It's a form of mental rehearsal or visualization that Stoics might use to embody their philosophical ideals. For instance, you might say to yourself, I am someone who remains calm under pressure, even if you currently struggle with anxiety and stressful situations. By doing so, you're not only setting a psychological precedent for your behavior, but also reinforcing the identity you want to embrace. Future self-talk is effective because it helps bridge the gap between your current state and your goals. It allows you to act as if you have already achieved your aspirations, which can be incredibly motivating. This method is grounded in the Stoic practice of as-if behavior, where Stoics would act as if they possessed certain virtues they were still cultivating. For example, acting as if one is patient, wise, or courageous in situations that demand these qualities. Moreover, these practices are not just about personal ambition, but about aligning oneself with a greater good. When you use empowering questions and future self-talk, you're also considering how your actions and growth can contribute to the well-being of others, a key component of Stoic philosophy, which emphasizes the interconnectedness of all people. To integrate these practices into your life, start by identifying areas where you feel stuck or unsatisfied. Formulate specific empowering questions that reframe these challenges as opportunities for growth. Practice future self-talk daily, envisioning yourself handling these challenges with the virtues you wish to embody. This could be during your morning routine as you set intentions for the day, or through journaling exercises where you write from the perspective of your future, more evolved self. Thank you for joining me today and for being an integral part of our live Virtue Stoic community. Remember, the journey to a virtuous and fulfilled life is ongoing, and every step, every thought, every word counts toward building the future you envision for yourself. Keep questioning, keep talking to your future self, and most importantly, keep growing. If you found today's discussion enriching and want to dive deeper into the Stoic way of living, check out the suggested videos on your screen. Let's continue to grow and inspire each other. Until next time, stay strong, stay wise, and live stoically.